Coming up on the Civil Discourse, Dr. Julia Twigg from the University of Kent in England, and a leading writer in the field of age studies, discusses her fascinating research on the topic of fashion and aging.
Magazines like Vogue are much more aware of diversity generally, and that's particularly marked in relation to issues to do with race, ethnicity, size. All of those have begun to be much better represented within magazines like that. Age is still sort of hovering on the edges, I think.
Hello and welcome to the Civil Discourse. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, Dean of the Pennoni Honors College at Drexel University, speaking to you from my home in Center City, Philadelphia. Today, my guest is Julia Twigg, an Emeritus Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at the University of Kent in England. She's the author of the book, Fashion and Age, Dress, the Body, and Later Life. Dr. Twigg's research attempts to shift the discourse away from aging as infirmity to encompass more vital and positive elements. Julia Twigg, welcome to the Civil Discourse.
Thank you.
Well, your field is cultural gerontology, and I wonder if you would tell us what that is.
Well, cultural gerontology represents, I think, some of the most exciting new work that's going on in age studies, as we often call it now. And it's an attempt really to get away from the dominance of work on frailty, decline, public policy issues. All of those are really important. I wouldn't want to sort of go away from that work. I've done work in that tradition myself. But there's more to be said about later years, as it tends to be called within this new approach, than simply that public policy discourse. And so cultural gerontology has tried to widen what we talk about, humanize, focus on experiential aspects and on an altogether wider set of connections. And it also draws on the development of within arts and humanities, new interest in age as a subject.
So it's about really the vitality of living as opposed to dealing with the infirmities of age. And I can really appreciate that. And that includes fashion, which you have focused on, and I think is fascinating because it's such a vexed topic for women, also for men. And we'll get to that because you've written on that subject as well. But tell me about, first of all, I guess it connects to material culture in general and your interest in material culture. You refer to body work as a category as opposed to social work. Is that another way of saying what you've just told us?
Yes, I mean, it's an earlier piece of work that I did, which was about trying to sort of recognize the ways in which the care of older people is not just to be seen within policy or social work, but is also about the nuts and bolts of actual body care. It's about lifting, it's cleaning, it's often dirty work. And in fact, one of the things that's important to understand that is precisely those things, but in a way that's not denigrating of it. I think one of the problems about writing about this in the past has been people have felt, well, to emphasize all this is to emphasize negativity and expose older people and things, which is true. So we need to be careful. But we also need to recognize what this actually involves, the sort of literal, physical, embodied aspect of that kind of care work.
Yeah, it's something that has occurred to me, having had aging parents. This idea of dying with dignity always struck me as a problematic phrase because it puts so much weight on a certain kind of look, so to speak, which not everybody can have. And there is dirty work associated with aging and with the body in general. And I think that's what you're saying. But to shift the gears to fashion, which is after all beauty in some form, what do you say? And I understand very well this idea of wanting to think about the aging body and fashion. But what do you say when people say that fashion is by definition about youth and beauty. And this is a capitalistic system we live in, and people want to sell clothes. What's your response to that?
Well, all of those are completely true. And I think it's important to recognize that the entire fashion industry is in the grips of this sort of image of fashion, which is inherently youthful. I think that's true. But the other half is to say, well, look, the fashion industry is also about simply clothing the nation. And, you know, it's the garment industry too. And in a way, if you look at it through the lens of dress rather than fashion, that's more helpful. Everyone has in our culture is dressed in some way, presents the body in some way or other. And if you go in that way, then I think it's easier, because you understand dress as an everyday body practice. It's part of how we all express ourselves, present ourselves in a social world.
Do you see magazines, I guess Vogue in particular, as being more aware or more interested in the aging body in recent years?
I think they've modestly sort of put their toe in the water, carefully, as it were. I mean, I think magazines like Vogue are much more aware of diversity generally. And that's particularly marked in relation to issues to do with race, ethnicity, size. All of those have begun to be much better represented within magazines like that. Age is still sort of hovering on the edges, I think. And when age is presented, it's often presented in a very distinctive way, like a model, and of course she was always lovely, with long, beautiful, flowing silver locks. And you know, you can say, well, no model looks like most of us, so it's not a surprise that he doesn't look like most of us. But it's been a cautious approach, I think, is what you said.
And yet you do make mention of a model in the 1950s in Vogue called, and she had a name, Mrs. Exeter. She was figured, and she in many advertisements or in many fashion spreads. And she is, I suppose, she's supposed to be in her 50s and 60s, and then she disappeared. And I wonder how you understand that. Was there more of an understanding of age, or at least middle age, in fashion in the middle of the 20th century than later?
Yes, I mean, and Mrs. Exeter appeared in American Vogue too. She represents a particular type of elegant, middle-aged, assured, placed and located Mrs. Exeter. She's very much a 40s, 50s kind of figure. So she's acknowledged and she's recognized, but she's very defined in terms of social class and age and position like that. And essentially what kills her off is the 1960s. And the fashion of the 1960s are, extremely youth oriented. I mean, I can remember this. You know, they're short skirts, they're almost baby doll like quality to the 60s fashion. And it went like a hurricane through this more elegant Dior-y like kind of landscape before. And that was the end, as it were, of that kind of Mrs. Exeter figure. So when age begins to appear a little bit again in Vogue in the early this century, it's an integrated image. It's an idea of ageless beauty.
It's interesting that you could almost say that the age, Mrs. Exeter, who was very class bound, disappeared as we became more democratic in some ways, as well as youth oriented.
I agree.
And so now she has to reappear in a less classist way, which maybe is more difficult. I've always felt it was ironic, Julia, that high fashion is so expensive and yet so youth-oriented. And I wonder if you have thoughts about the fact that the people that can afford those clothes are generally older women. And when you look at Vogue magazine, for example, they look like fashion that could only be worn by younger bodies. How is that reconciled?
Well, I think one way it's reconciled is to recognize the extent to which real high fashion is not really aimed at people who wear it. It's aimed at image building for the secondary market of scent, handbags, all those sorts of things. So that's, although there are very clearly very rich women buying couturier clothes, they're not really what's driving it economically. What's driving it economically are the secondary sales. And things like handbags, you've only got to think of the cost of handbags. And one of the things about handbags, of course, are that they're not really age related. You can have a really expensive handbag when you're 70 or 80, you know, and you look very good. So I think that's what's happening.
Well, on the subject of handbags, and you've written about handbags, which I think are fascinating. I mean, as symbolic structures, so to speak, material things. Could you tell us about how that functions and what you've discovered with respect to the attachment that women have to their handbags?
Well, I think we noticed that this was a study of people, men and women, with living with dementia and the role of dress in their lives. And we noticed how some of the women in the care home lounge, as it were, the place they would be sitting in the day, would be there with their handbag, and that their handbag would be beside them, as it by the table and chair. And it was partly, I think, a habitual behavior. You know, women are used to having their handbag with them. You know, it's a common sort of experience, I think. And it reminded me of some other work people have done about how habitual gestures, like an elderly woman who brought the pearls from behind her jumper and placed them nicely. So these kind of very nice gestures. And the handbag was a sort of, it was a source of objects that were familiar, that might have some kind of connection. It was something you could rummage in, you know, in a spare moment. I mean, I think lots of women have used handbags to kind of just sort of see what's happening and, you know, that sort of thing. And it was a source, it was a link to identity. I think that was one of the things. Not all women had it, and there came a stage typically when people ceased to be interested in that, but it was part of life in the care home.
And I guess, well, I was going to say shoes, but I wonder if you've done anything with the idea of women having to move from very high heels to small heels to flats as they get older. And that transition, which for my mother was very, very difficult when she no longer could balance well. I remember it was a source of real distress for her. Have you come across anything regarding shoes?
I haven't done direct work in shoes, but other people have. And I recognize very much that transition, particularly for women who've liked really high fashion, high heels. And you're right, as balance it's not so good, it becomes dangerous. Also, as feet change, you can't necessarily fit into the kind of stylish shoes. So there is a tendency to move towards softer shoes and to move towards slippers and things like that. And for some women, that's a, you know, source of regret.
Well, you've done work on men and fashion and masculinity in fashion. I find that fascinating. You know, it's so interesting to think that generally we think of men as being liberated in not having to think about fashion. On the other hand, I feel it's a limitation for them in that they haven't traditionally been allowed to, although more so now. What's your thought about men in fashion? I guess you've also looked at men aging and fashion and how it compares with women's aging and fashion. Any insights there?
Well, I agree with you. I think it's a double-edged thing. I think men have the freedom of the uniform. You just put your suit on, it's a decent suit and a tie, you go in, nobody says anything. Whereas a woman, let's say a politician or senior person, you know, there's always a kind of commentary on that green jacket, was it a good idea, kind of stuff. So I think men are freed by the fashion system at the moment, but I think they lose in terms of expressivity. You know, clothes for many women are a source of pleasure, of interest, of talk to other women, and they aren't for men. So I think men lose out in that way. So I think you're right, it's a double thing.
So do you feel that men are less connected to their bodies and their body changes than women because of that connection to fashion?
That's a very interesting question, Paula. I don't know. Women's lifelong engagement with their bodies is of a different character, by and large, don't want to be crude about this, than that of men. And there are a lot of positives and a lot of negatives. I think what was interesting about talking to older men, in a parallel to the study I did with older women, was that some of the themes that were very prominent for women weren't really so very much. So, for example, a lot of women experienced what I call the changing room moment. They went into a changing room, they tried on the dress, they looked at themselves in the mirror, and I thought, not me, not anymore. And that's a very common experience. Now, none of the men I talked to had that experience. Some of them sort of thought, they did. Age wasn't really all that central, in other words, to their view of dress, in the way that as soon as you talk to women about this issue, they knew what I was talking about, and they had different views, but they did know. Whereas men, it was kind of a bit off the radar. And also there was an interesting difference in that there was a sort of discourse for some men of older dress and older values, a positive image. So yes, I do dress in a suit and I do put on a tie when I go to the parish council meeting. It's a mark of respect. And, I don't go about in silly youth clothes and all these ways that young men are. So they saw youthful dress as silly and foolish, something they really didn't want to get involved in. Whereas for a lot of the women, younger dress was something rather longed for, but recognized you can't wear it anymore. There was a kind of element of regret. I think you're right that if you look at younger men, then they're much more interested in fashion. I don't think that particularly reached the kind of men I was interviewing, but that kind of metrosexual man, I think there is an interest. I think it's part really a lot to do with the growth of consumption. We've got a consumption culture in all areas of life, and younger people are drawn into that more. And so I think we will see a generation of men coming through who are more actively engaged in fashion, who see it as just part of their life much more. Slightly sort of paradoxically, the growth of something that's called modest fashion, which is fashion that derives particularly from religious groups, Muslim communities, but not only Muslim communities, is quite a major international growth. And modest fashion in many ways is fashion that also suits older women because it's typically more covered up. And so there are sort of slightly left of field influences coming in that may affect clothing, sources for clothing for older women.
That's interesting. I hadn't been aware of something called modest fashion, which is why I am befuddled by why there isn't more of an emphasis on older women, since they can spend. And that seems not to have registered as strongly as one would think in the fashion industry.
I agree. I found that a paradox. I put it to some of them and they agreed too. And that somehow they find it difficult to find their way towards identifying a customer. I agree with you, there's actually a lot of women, particularly with the growth of careers and senior careers, who have actually got a lot of disposable money and do perfectly happy to spend it. So I'm not sure why is the answer. I think there's still a paradox there. They haven't adjusted themselves quite to how to do that, how to carry that off. Part of the problem is that you want to signal that your clothes are suitable, good, going to really work for your older market without ever using that language of older or signaling it in an overt way. And so it's partly that tension that they have.
They haven't found the vocabulary.
That's right.
Right.
I mean, ageless style is probably one of the easiest ones. I mean, terms like classic, I have to say, classic in the industry.
Classic, elegant,
Elegant, yes, those things. Now, they're fine, actually, because they're positive things, but
yes,
they haven't nailed it. I think that I agree with you. They haven't.
I agree so much with you. This is something that I'm fascinated by, because for women, we have been taught to think of our bodies as canvases, so to speak, as artists would. And we're denigrated for it, but it's also a source of great creativity. And so as the body changes, it's very problematic for us. And then I know you've written about design and the fact that designers, do they think about the changing body when they design clothes? Because women's bodies do change in very sometimes subtle ways, but that make clothes look different on them, even if they remain thin. It doesn't hang the same way. And yet you could imagine that a really good designer for older bodies could work with that.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And if you talk to manufacturers who address this market, they know very well there are aspects of the ways in which bodies change for women and for men. That means they need to adjust the cut. They need to make it wider in the middle. They need to move the shoulders forward. There are various techniques, and they know those. I think, though, as part of the kind of status, we talked earlier about how the fashion industry is enthralled, in a sense, with an ideal of youthfulness. And I think if you're a high status designer, you're not going to be doing that kind of designing so much. You're going to be aiming at that high fashion element of the market. That's just part of the values of the fashion system, even though they know perfectly well that the most of their clothes are going to mainstream people in middle years and older.
And it's interesting that in some of these magazines, when they have the older woman, she's in her 40s or at the top 50s, as opposed to 80s or 90s, which we are seeing more and more of. So it's very interesting to me. I wonder if you've done anything with shopping and the act itself of going out into stores and looking for clothes and female bonding in that regard, because that strikes me as being very related to fashion.
Yes, I haven't written directly about that, but you're quite right. I think looking at clothes, reviewing clothes, shopping is a major part of quite a lot of women's lives, and an enjoyable part too, and a sociable part, as you say, done with sisters and friends and things like that. There was a classic, in contrast with the men, it was interesting in the study of men. I had men who were kind of, I did have men who chose their clothes, shopped alone. They tended to the ones who were more oriented, stylish, as it were, to interest in that. Then I had quite a bulk who shopped socially with their wives, as it were. And then I had a small group of what I called taken in hand men, who were more or less, whose wives more or less sorted out their clothes.
Yes, I know men like that. And they still exist in large numbers, but I think less so
Yes.
among younger men.
Yeah.
So did you find when you were talking to men about fashion that they enjoyed the conversation? I mean, I think that men, there's a kind of a undercurrent of interest, even if they don't look fashionable, or even if they don't have much of a choice, within their range, their limited range, there is an interest in clothes that I think you probably tapped into.
Yes, I mean, there's what I call the norm of low engagement, which is the dominant approach is you're not interested. I don't do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But then as soon as you get talking to them, yes, they're very interested actually, and they're aware about these things. They talk about it in a different way from women, in that there isn't the open engagement with fashion, and particularly the word fashion is very off-putting to British men. But they're very interested in different clothes and how things are presented. And a lot of men's clothes in Britain certainly are what I call close-coded, i.e. what matters is this sort of buttons, how many buttons there are here, the sort of shirt, and there's a lot of discernment and,
discernment.
Contempt and approval for very minor differences, the wrong sort of shoes, that kind of thing.
That's so interesting. They're really able to parse the way you might parse a poem or whatever, those small details of dress, which I think women too can do at a certain level with a handbag and so forth. They can tell what's good and what's not so good. We're nearing the end, but I wanted to ask you about what areas of study do you think open up as more people enter the category of the so-called elderly?
Well, I do think the expansion of this, what I've called cultural gerontology, this wider understanding of the experience, particularly of the third age, because one of the things that we're talking about really is the emergence of a blurred third age, whereas in the past we had an idea of old age, something that started at rigidly at retirement, didn't last all that long. Whereas now we've got really, in a way, a long trajectory of middle age going into, well, it's not defined in terms of numbers, but it's going into 70s, 80s for people like that, really until the eruption of serious ill health. That's the thing that still makes a difference when we move into the fourth age. But we've got a large cultural category of the third age, and I think there's a lot to be explored in that area.
I agree. And of course, one never knows if you're going to have the third age or not, or how long it's going to last.
Well, that's something I think also important. We've talked in a fairly unitary way about older people, but of course, the experience of being older is very heavily affected by social class, by stratification, by race, by all sorts of structural factors that we know about. And so it's important also to bear those in mind. So, there's a whole list, and in a sense, this is the debate around intersectionality and the emergence of all these categories. In that, age has really only come fairly late to the table, and I don't think it's often included in the list. When people, as it were, produce a list of the intersectional elements or want to talk about dimensions difference, age isn't always there. And I think my argument would be that it is. I think age is a very profound social structuring, cultural structuring element.
The difference, though, Julia, of course, is that we can all hope to be old.
Yeah.
So
right.
In other words, it's quite a democratic idea, whereas the others are more partitioned by definition as to what you were born into. But people don't realize they're going to be old when they're young.
They don't, not deep here, no.
Not deep.
Right.
Then suddenly they wake up and they're surprised. I do think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I recommend your book, Fashion and Age, to our audience. And I thank you for talking to me from England, which I find rather exciting that we could do this. So thank you for joining us today.
Okay, lovely.
And thank you for joining us today for the Civil Discourse.